Right now, if you drive through Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you will see a quiet street, some restaurants, some small businesses, nothing special. But in 1921, 100 years ago, this exact street was called something else. It was called Black Wall Street, and it was the wealthiest black community in the entire United States of America. Black-owned hotels, black-owned law firms, black-owned hospitals, black-owned newspapers, a community of over 10,000 people who had built something extraordinary out of nothing. And then, in less than 18 hours, it was gone, burned to the ground by a mob, with the help of airplanes and the full knowledge of the city government. This is the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history, and one of the most successfully buried. To understand what was destroyed that night, you first have to understand what had been built. And that story begins not in Tulsa, but in the aftermath of the Civil War. When slavery ended in 1865, millions of black Americans were free, but had nothing. No land, no money, no education. The government had promised 40 acres and a mule. They never delivered. So, black Americans did what humans do. They built. They saved. They educated their children. They created communities. And in Oklahoma, a state that had only joined the Union in 1907, some of them found an opportunity. The Greenwood District of Tulsa was incorporated in 1906, and over the next 15 years, it became something remarkable. By 1921, Greenwood had Black Wall Street. By the numbers, 1921, 600 plus black-owned businesses, 36 doctors, dentists, and lawyers, 2 newspapers, 1 hospital, 1 bank, 2 schools with black principals, 13 plus churches, 10,000 residents. The man who gave Greenwood its nickname was Booker T. Washington. When he visited in 1905, he was so impressed that he called it the Negro Wall Street of America. The name stuck and eventually became simply Black Wall Street. Now, here is something important to understand. This community was not successful because they were given anything. They were successful despite being given nothing. Oklahoma had strict segregation laws. Black residents could not shop in white stores, could not use white hospitals, could not attend white schools. So they built their own. And what they built was extraordinary. Money circulated within the Greenwood community up to 36 times before leaving. For comparison, today in modern black communities, $1 leaves within 6 hours. Black Wall Street had built something that most communities never achieve: true economic self-sufficiency. And this success, this extraordinary achievement, is exactly what made certain people in Tulsa very, very angry. May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day, Tulsa, Oklahoma. A 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland walked into the Drexel building on South Main Street. He needed to use the elevator. It was one of the few elevators in Tulsa that black residents were permitted to use. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. What exactly happened in that elevator? Nobody knows for certain. What we do know is this: Sarah Page screamed, Dick Rowland ran, and a white man in the lobby called the police. The next morning, May 31st, the Tulsa Tribune ran a front-page headline. It read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." There was no evidence. There had been no investigation. Dick Rowland had not been charged with anything. But the headline was printed, and in 1921, Tulsa. That was enough. The Tulsa police arrested Dick Rowland and took him to the Tulsa County Courthouse. By evening, a crowd of white men had gathered outside. Within hours, that crowd numbered over 1,500. They wanted to lynch him. Right there, outside the courthouse. Word reached Greenwood. And here is where something remarkable happened. Something that history books rarely mention. Black veterans of World War I, men who had fought for this country in the trenches of France, armed themselves and went to the courthouse. Not to start a fight, to protect Dick Rowland from being lynched without a trial. There were about 75 of them, facing a mob of 1,500. They told the white sheriff, "We are here to help if you need us." The sheriff told them to go home, that everything was under control. Most of them left. At around 10 p.m., a white man tried to disarm one of the remaining black veterans. A shot was fired. To this day, nobody knows who fired first. It does not matter. Because what happened next was not a riot. It was not a conflict between two equal groups. What happened next was a massacre. The black veterans retreated back toward Greenwood. The white mob followed. And as they moved through the streets, the mob grew. Men were joining from bars, from homes, from the streets, armed with rifles, pistols, whatever they could find. The Tulsa Police Department, rather than stopping the mob, began deputizing members of it. Let me say that again. The police were giving badges and weapons to members of the attacking mob, official authority to do what they were already doing. By midnight, Greenwood was under attack. Homes were being broken into, businesses were being looted, and then set on fire. Families were running into the streets with whatever they could carry. Children, elderly, everyone fleeing. But here is what made the Tulsa Massacre different from other racial attacks of that era. Here is the detail that most Americans do not know. The attack was not just on the ground. It was from the air. The next morning, we will cover this in part 2. Those planes returned. And what they did in the daylight hours of June 1st, 1921, is almost impossible to believe. But that night, the first night, was already catastrophic. Families who had built their homes over decades watched them burn in minutes. The Dreamland Theater, gone. The Stratford Hotel, one of the most luxurious black-owned hotels in America, gone. Churches, schools, clinics, all burning. Survivors described the scene as looking like a war zone. One resident, a woman named Mabel Little, said she looked back from the edge of the district and saw the sky completely orange. Everything she had ever known was on fire. Some residents tried to defend their homes. They were shot. Others tried to hide. Many were found and taken to one of several internment camps the city had quickly set up, where black Tulsans were held at gunpoint with no charges, no trial, no explanation. By dawn on June 1st, the first night was over, but the worst was still coming. And that is where we will pick up in part 2. Because what happened in the daylight hours of June 1st, 1921, is even darker than what I have just told you. Before we close part 1, I want to give you some context about what made this massacre possible, because it did not come out of nowhere. In 1921, America was in the grip of the Red Summer, a period from 1919 to 1923 where racial violence against Black Americans exploded across the country. In Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in dozens of other cities. Greenwood was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern. But Tulsa was different in scale, different in organization, and different in what happened afterward. Because after the fires went out, the city of Tulsa did something that would define the next 75 years. They chose to forget, completely and deliberately. Newspaper archives from that period were physically removed from libraries. The massacre was not taught in Oklahoma schools. It was not mentioned in official city histories. For an entire generation, children in Tulsa grew up not knowing that this had happened in their own city. In part 2, we will show you exactly what happened the next morning when the sun rose over Tulsa. The airplanes, the final destruction of Greenwood, the death toll that the city refused to count, the survivors who were never compensated, and the extraordinary story of how 75 years later the truth finally began to come out. That video goes up next date. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it. If this story shocked you, if you had never heard of Black Wall Street before today, I want you to drop a comment below, because I think you will find that most people watching this had no idea this happened. And that silence, that erasure, is itself part of the story. I will see you in part 2. Stay with me. Let me tell you about a few people whose stories represent thousands of others. John Williams owned the Dreamland Theater, the most elegant cinema in all of Oklahoma, black or white. He had built it in 1914. That night, he stood outside and watched it burn. He was not allowed to approach. He was ordered to an internment camp. He rebuilt and kept rebuilding until the city blocked every permit. The Dreamland was never the same again. Mabel Little was 22 years old. She and her husband had just opened a beauty salon. They had been saving for 3 years. That night, they grabbed their 2 children and ran. When she returned 2 days later, there was nothing. Not the salon, not their home, not even the foundation. Just ash and broken glass. O.W. Gurley, often called the father of Greenwood, had built much of the district himself. He owned 22 buildings. In the morning of June 1st, he was arrested, held without charge, and when released, found that every one of his 22 buildings had been destroyed. He would later testify to investigators that the police told him, and I'm quoting, "We are not going to let this darky district be rebuilt.